like to start off just by welcoming everyone to this webcast and thanking you for taking the time out to join us today. We're very excited to share this research with you. We had such an interesting time in the first leg of research last year, and this year we feel like we've gone deeper and come up with some real pearls from the bottom of the ocean, and we're excited to share those with you. So I'd like to quickly just first introduce everyone who's with us here on the team. And Amanda, I think you're driving. There we are. So on the line today, and all of us will be speaking at various points, we have Amanda Bala, who's an associate partner in our practice. She's done a wonderful job leading this leg of research in partnership with Christine Brandt-Jones, who looks after our insight and analytics function here at Profit. My name is Tony Frost, and Helen and I together look after our organization and culture practice here at Profit. I'm based in New York, and Helen is based in London in the UK. And you will hear each of our voices as we go along. So for those of you who are not familiar with Profit, just a brief introduction. We're a firm that's focused on helping clients grow through transformation. And we believe that right now, particularly in the age of digital and also post-COVID, it's a particularly germane time to think about transformation of businesses. It's a highly disruptive moment, and it's accelerating everyone's expectations about what they should receive from other organizations. And so we believe that the best approach to this, despite the fact that it's the digital age, is a human-centered one. And so you'll see echoed throughout the research our human-centered transformation model, which really drives every way, every dimension of how we think about transformation at Profit. Our practice focuses on 4 key questions with our clients. So the first is defining and harnessing a compelling purpose to drive performance in the organization, creating a culture that thrives on change. We believe very strongly that change management is somewhat dated as a concept, and that in this age of disruption, everyone needs to be change ready and to actually thrive on change. And we help clients design cultures for their organizations, or seed cultures for their organizations that help them to achieve that. Building and sustaining the capabilities that you need to win in a digital world, and ultimately transforming the organization in such a way that you can power growth from the inside. So here's how we're going to spend our time today. We're going to talk a little bit about culture as a catalyst and why we think it's more relevant than ever. One of the new findings from this year's research is 4 different pathways to think about cultural transformation at your organization. We'll hear some stories from the field, and then I'll be emceeing some Q&A. And with that, I'll hand it off to Helen. Oh, so good point. One little administrative note. There is a Q&A function if you're not familiar with it in Zoom. It's in the lower right-hand corner. So anything that you drop into that, we will address later in the webinar. If you'd like to add comments as we go along in the chat, that's welcome as well. All yours, Helen.
Thanks, Tony. So we've now got 104 people participating. There'll be a few Profit folk in that number, but we'd really like to learn a bit more about the group that have joined us in whatever time zone it is in your part of the world. So we'd like to ask you a couple of questions. So first of all, we'd really like to ask about what best describes your company transformation. This was a question that we asked in our research, and we'll be giving you a little bit of a picture about what we learned. But if you could vote, that should be on your screens and you're able to vote, that would be great to see where our audience is. We'll give you a few moments to do that. And I know Amanda behind the scenes will hit the button when she feels that we've got a quorum of responses. That's the joy of Zoom, which I'm sure many people on this line have discovered in the weeks and months that we've been through. Interesting. So we have, about 76% in the midst of transformation. So quite an interesting number, and higher actually than the figure that we had in our research. So let's hope we can help you in the coming 50 minutes or so with some advice and guidance on what you're experiencing. The next question we'd like to ask you, and this is just to see the range, if you want, of organisational functions or departments that are present for our webinar. Which of the following best describes your department? Again, in the research, we had a really well-represented range, which we'll show you in a few moments, but interesting to see who's joined us today. And thanks to my colleagues who are already jumping into the chat function and answering the questions that are coming up, which is great. So here we go. So marketing, strategy, HR, leading there, but yeah, a good range. Okay, super, thank you. That's really interesting to see. So let's talk about culture as a catalyst and the reason it is more relevant than ever. Tony mentioned to you our very central view that we need to take a human-centered approach to transformation. And this is the model that is very much central to our thinking in the organisation culture practice at Profit. We say that and believe passionately, as our research has shown us over the last few years, that transformation depends on a holistic approach across the 4 key elements of this model. So like a human, we see the organisation having DNA, a mind, a body and a soul. And what do we mean by these? By DNA, we mean the codification of the organisation that helps us understand our destination and direction of travel. By soul, we talk to the mindset, behaviours, story systems, rituals that ignite belief in the change we're trying to achieve. In mind, we're thinking very much about the skills and capabilities required to get to our destination. And in body, we're thinking about the operating model, the governance, the processes, the roles, the systems and tools that might need to change or might need to be redesigned and rebuilt to achieve our transformation goals. So last year in 2019, we did another piece of global research where we identified key leaders of cultural change in service of transformation in the digital age. We uncovered 6 fundamentals very much across all elements of our human-centered transformation model set out there, and 5 accelerators. Our fundamentals were very clearly what organisations reported were important and made the difference in successful change. The accelerators came from statistical analysis, really searching for the hidden drivers that sat, if you want, behind these fundamentals. Fundamentals being the table stakes, accelerators being exactly what they say on the tin, and very often these 2 working together in sync. But one of whilst this was extremely kind of well-received research and we had a lot of very positive feedback from clients about the insight that it offered them, and also the fact that it made it clear that one had to work, as we said, throughout the human-centered transformation model, there were some questions that arose from clients and users of our research. So we wanted to explore further some key questions. The first really one was about how we implement these levers. So more than ever before, companies are searching for pragmatic guidance on how to actually approach transformation. We wanted to help clients understand where they needed to focus. And if we just move on, Amanda, to the next couple of slides, we wanted to help clients understand how they implement and where they focus, because successful application of a few levers was really what clients wanted to understand about. They wanted not to have to think about all 11, but to understand, was there a pattern to how they could work with these levers, and then expand their efforts from this initial focus. Better to have a route through the levers and the human transformation model than to lose impact through a partial effort across the full set. So that's what we set out to explore. But then the world transformed, and we'd started our research very much at the beginning of the year in a qualitative phase, and then moved into a quantitative phase. And in the midst of all that, the world went upside down. And it's very easy, I think, to consider that changed everything, and it has changed many things, but it actually has accelerated for many organizations the digital transformation efforts that perhaps were not getting the attention and focus they deserved. And this little image here went around a lot of social media. Who led the digital transformation of your company? It was possibly sitting there not maybe getting the attention it deserved, and COVID-19 change that. So what we wanted to do is, with our findings, was really create an actionable playbook for transformation that actually, and now the focus is very much, coming out of COVID, and we hope we are coming out of COVID-19, but a transformation playbook for good times and bad, something that actually helps people understand how to grasp the levers we identified last year and actually achieve impact and results. So as I said, we took our research out to market through the first quarter of this year, and we engaged nearly 500 transformation leaders to shape our findings. This was very consistent with our 2019 research base, where we similarly talked to leaders across the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and China. It is notable that actually the field research in China was in play in February, which was undoubtedly, at a very difficult time for the pandemic in that country. You'll see that 67% of people said that transformation was in progress, obviously slightly lower than the group that's on this call today. And you'll see that the seniority level was high. We were talking to 60% of transformation leaders at the C-suite level. But the positive for us about that is that it gives us an enterprise-wide view, having that seniority of people involved in the study. So that sets us up, and I just want to remind you, as we go now into exploring the key findings, to use the Q&A feature, and please jump in with what don't you know that you want to know. In this fairly short session, we are going to try and cover as much detail as we can, but there is, as Tony said, a lot of great findings that have allowed us to be very confident about the foundations we laid in our research this year, but even more confident of the practical playbook that the research findings offer to those who want to engage with it. So, as we mentioned at the start, we uncovered what we're calling 4 pathways of cultural change. So looking at our data, we wanted to really determine if there were patterns in the levers companies view as most important to transformation. We also inevitably were validating once again our 11 levers, and they fared well through the research. They are still absolutely the key catalysts, and companies reported progress across many of them. But what's more important, I think, is really understanding whether there has been any kind of clustering to how people are leaning in to using those levers. And we identified four groups. Let me just also take a moment to just define the word pathways as well, because pathways suggest something somewhat fixed, and this is not what we're meaning at all. They represent a focus. It might be an entry point into our human-centered transformation model, but it's not an end destination in its own right. It is still absolutely critical that organizations think holistically about all four elements in the model. But what we did see was a pattern where organizations might lean in the first instance, or when they saw a particular barrier that they felt demanded a particular focused approach. So the first pathway is defining, which is very much around establishing the destination and leadership for transformation, and is clearly aligned to the DNA element of our model. So you might consider this pathway the control tower for all other pathways, really, because DNA should serve to continually guide transformation. I have to say, even though DNA is typically enduring, companies are probably needing to revisit to ensure DNA is in sync with longer term goals. And again, I think COVID-19 has brought a sharp focus to that. The next pathway is around directing. So this is very much about building an operating model that makes the transformation real and is most aligned to body. Before COVID-19, we as a practice would often talk about how most organizations were not really designed for the age in which they find themselves. And they were kind of built not for today's digital age. Well, I think, again, COVID-19 might have also suggested they're also brought into kind of stark reality in a post-COVID world as well, as we see many organizations question whether their operating model has got the resilience it needs and is responding to the accelerated transformation of the world around us. You might see in this change focus area things like pushing decision-making rights downwards. That's one of the key levers from last year, aligning incentives and effective KPIs. And we tested this year the use of an empowered transformation management office. And when I've set out these four pathways, Amanda's going to take you through more detail about the stories that lie behind these pathways. Our third pathway is around enabling transformation. So identifying, sourcing and developing the required capabilities for the transformation efforts. And inevitably, this is most aligned to mind. I think this has been a very well reported area in bodies of research around the question of whether an organization has got the skills, but we saw very definitely a pattern of behavior for some organizations around this, around upgrading their ways to identify, recruit and retain talent. And that brings me to the fourth pathway, which is around motivating the cultural shift. So this is aligning top leaders to role model, developing meaningful mechanisms to enable employees to adapt, including the space to experiment and the space to fail, which is an interesting area which we'll talk to, and other levers like recognizing and rewarding progress. And this very much aligns to the focus of soul within our human-centered transformation model. So, as I mentioned, we felt very much that what you could see happening with these pathways and these cluster of responses that we found in the data was that they were very much responding to perceptions of a primary cultural roadblock. So under defining, this is very much aligned to a concern around lack of clarity. And in the report, you'll see mention of sort of some water cooler comments as sort of cultural indicators of what might be happening when this is playing out in an organization. And we hear it from clients where comments like, we have so many strategic elements in our system, people are confused, they cannot see just where we're going and what we're trying to achieve here. Under directing, we see legacy operating model issues. And it's interesting in the COVID-19 context, because I think the crisis and the immediate response to it had many organizations looking to actually push decision-making rights down with no other choice, and organizations potentially finding an agility in the way they do things that they hadn't necessarily discovered before, but they do not want to lose in the post-COVID world. Against enabling, we see the issue of legacy talent models. You know, the statement, we really don't know what skills we need, is a sort of telling one. And we see as a practice a growing interest in strategic workforce planning that was happening before COVID-19, but we see will be accelerated as digital transformation efforts get accelerated as a result. And finally, under motivating, we see the question of alignment. You know, it manifests itself in many ways, but you know, nothing changing at the top in terms of the role modeling of leaders is a very telling one. And the issue of organizations' comfort with experimentation and failure is another. So I've set out there the 4 pathways. I'm going to hand over to Amanda to put a lot more colour to that story, but I would remind you that we have our Q&A feature. Submit the questions you'd like to be discussed. What don't you know that you want to know, and we will try and help you.
Great, thanks, Helen. So in order to figure out where to start our discussion, we want to hear from you. So we've developed in-depth findings, both in terms of the data as well as what we learned in our leadership interviews. And to figure out how we want to navigate through those, I'm going to launch another poll. And what we'd like to do is understand, of the 4 cultural roadblocks that Helen just laid out, which one do you believe is most relevant for your organization? What's that one roadblock that, if you didn't address it, you know, would truly impede the progress of your transformation? So I'm going to pull that up, and that will help us figure out what order we want to step through the rest of the deck in. All right, it looks like we have a critical mass. So I'm going to end the polling now. And I will say, I think you all made it easy for me in that we are seeing a pretty even split across the 4 cultural roadblocks. It looks like lack of clarity, which we said is the one that would lead into the path for defining the transformation, is the first, but the others aren't too far behind. So with that, I'm going to step through the pathways in the same order that Helen shared them. So let's get into it. I'm going to stop sharing here. All right, so defining the transformation. And again, you know, transformation stories from the field. I think what's nice about this research is we really did have some very in-depth interviews with leaders all around the world, spanning a number of different positions. and then we're able to use the quantitative data to really understand those more at scale. And so what we've tried to do is pull in learnings from both of those aspects of research. So starting on what the data told us for defining the transformation, Helen mentioned one of the key levers here is really clarifying who's going to lead the transformation. And so we asked our survey respondents 2 questions. Across different levels of leadership, who do they see as really most critical to the success of transformation? And then who's currently most responsible for driving transformation? And so we weren't necessarily surprised to see that the C-suite is seen as both most critical and most responsible. But the flip side of that did surprise us is the relatively low level of responsibility that's ascribed to middle management, or in some countries, what's referred to as line management. And in our experience, middle management is absolutely critical in terms of being true change agents for the organization, in that they're the ones who really connect the objectives for the transformation at the highest level to the day-to-day work of the employees that are in their charge. And so we think that there's a real risk if you overlook the role of middle management in truly serving as key change agents. Complementing that, the other key lever for defining the transformation is setting a powerful and actionable ambition. So an ambition is good, but on its own, it's not sufficient. It really needs to be powerful and actionable. And so we wanted to use some examples to unpack what we mean by those 2 words. So in terms of powerful, think about that as something that is, clear and compelling to really inspire action. And we heard a great example of that from a VP of strategy at American Family Insurance, which is a company primarily focused on property and casualty and auto insurance. And they've laid out a very audacious goal for their organization. So 2% profit margin, 2 times industry growth in 2 key ways: customer satisfaction and employee engagement. So if you think about that, it sounds simple, but there's some real magic to that, in that it's simple enough for every employee to be able to remember and to recite, but there is some real ambition in that as well, so that it's very inspiring. The actionable piece is about connecting ambition into what employees need to do differently. So it's not enough to put a lofty ambition out there and assume that employees are going to know what to do with it. It's really about connecting that ambition into a clear change strategy. So who are the key audiences that are going to be responsible for driving the change? What's the desired impact that you need to have with those audiences? And then what's the plan for how you're going to drive that? And understanding that things change. We heard that from the head of digital experience for the Asia region of Sun Life. And he talked about that there's a plan on paper, but as the world shifts, the plan also needs to keep up with that. And so that's really the value of a strong ambition, is it serves as a North Star, so that as the world shifts around you, you can continue to adapt your plan, but in a way that clearly ladders to that powerful, actionable ambition. So that's defining the transformation. Moving on to directing the transformation. So there's a number of key levers that are associated with directing the transformation, but we wanted to pull out data on one that we think is really powerful and has a lot of potential for organizations, and that is setting up a transformation management office, or a PMO, that's empowered to lead. And this is something that we've really seen have strong impact with our clients, and we believe has a lot more potential, because in fact, fewer than half of our survey respondents reference that they have made progress in setting up an empowered TMO. But for those who have done so, they're really seeing strong positive impact and more successful transformation. So what you see here is we asked respondents about what's the scope of responsibilities for your TMO, and split them into those who have full oversight and decision-making influence versus those that are more limited. And what you can see is for those TMOs that are truly empowered with full oversight and decision-making influence, they're seeing much more positive impact from the TMO and more successful transformations. And so what this leads to is when it comes to a really effective TMO, that it should go beyond project management and information gathering. And empowered TMOs are those that are able to really link strategy to action, break down functional silos, and truly coordinate initiatives across the roadmap in order to drive to impact. Another key lever that we wanted to spend some time on is actually the one lever that the survey respondents said they wish they had done in hindsight, but many have not yet been able to successfully do it, and it continues to be something that's pretty tough for organizations, which is pushing decision rights downward. And as we looked at the interviews, one of the key themes that came out in terms of companies that are able to break through and push decision rights downward is the move to use more agile methods. So for instance, Boots, which is a health and beauty retailer based out of the UK, that interviewee talked about they have a deeply ingrained culture, folks who have been there for a very long time and are used to sort of the protocols of asking for permission in triplicate, right? Things having to run multiple levels through the chain. And as their culture has begun to move to Agile, what they've seen is that it has kind of forced the decision-making toward those employees who are closer to the impact of the decisions to be made. And they're seeing very positive results from that. Things like breakthrough moves in terms of being able to set up their new flagship in Covent Garden in a far shorter time than they would have been able to previously. Similarly, we heard from DSM, which is a Dutch health and nutrition company, from their chief digital and chief marketing officer that Scrum has been, a natural way to push decision rights downward. So Scrum, being another agile method, something that brings kind of multiple teams together in solving for complex problems. And one of the core principles of Scrum is, self-organized teams. So they're really choosing how they're going to do the work. And so what that means is, by nature, they're the ones who are then taking on that, ownership over decision-making versus having directives being placed against them. And DSM has been seeing very strong impact from that, to the extent that they are, scaling these agile methods more broadly across the organization out of their traditional home within IT. Those are two of the key levers that we wanted to focus on for directing the transformation. Now, for enabling the transformation, again, a key lever here is identifying the skills, capabilities, and roles that are needed to make the transformation, and then developing the mechanisms to help reskill employees accordingly. And so learning development is, certainly very critical here. And one of the questions that we asked in our survey was, where are you making investments in terms of building the capability of your organization? And we thought it was interesting that the number one investment that's reported here in the data is actually enhancing the capability of learning and development. Companies realizing that making this a core capability is truly fundamental to their success. I think we've all heard how employees are increasingly kind of seeking out learning and development as one of the key factors in terms of which employer they're going to join. I also, saw an interesting data point the other day that 65% of those who are entering primary school now are ultimately going to be working in jobs that don't exist today. And so I think that really speaks to, the pace of change and maybe an entirely different set of skills, and how companies need to make sure that they're equipping their employees along the way. And so you can see the other investments that are being made behind learning and development, really creating enhanced learning platforms. So certainly, instructor-led training will always have an important place, but we see more and more that companies are investing behind more on-demand asynchronous learning, so that employees are able to learn, at the right time, at the right place, in the right way that really matters to what they're doing at that moment. And then also we're seeing on-the-job learning, real opportunities to kind of take the classroom or on-demand learning and apply it to real business situations. So with that, we heard two powerful examples in our interviews, and these relate to, really kind of a two-pronged approach, where once new capabilities are defined, part of it is about upskilling and reskilling your existing workforce, but oftentimes that's not sufficient. And so companies also really need to reimagine where and how they're going to source the talent that they need that has these new capabilities and skills. And so to the first point, we heard from the head of digital banking at MB Bank in Vietnam. They had kind of a legacy organization that they were trying to move to what they viewed as a really critical skill for their transformation, which was working in Agile. And so the way that they did that was, really making training the top priority, They brought in experts and they had them work, side by side with their people, week in, week out, and they were really able to make strong impact in terms of changing the way that their employees work. And I would say, in our experience at Profit, more and more we're seeing this model in terms of how we're working with our clients in a way that is, side by side, kind of building in skills transfer along the way, and really leading to positive results because those who are involved are, gaining greater understanding and buy-in into the work as they go. In terms of sourcing new talent, so we spoke to the Chief People Officer at dunnhumby, which is a global customer data science organization. And, tech talent is very critical for that organization. And they previously, were sort of recruiting wherever they found the right talent with the right profile. But what that meant was they had, talent who was kind of scattered across the globe and not necessarily, connected to where their key clients were or key places for the business. And so they set out to create more kind of tech hubs where they could really create centers of gravity for talent. And so one way they did that was by putting new technology in place to understand, where do people with these skill sets really reside? So for instance, for every 3 people with a certain skill in Manchester, there might be 6 in Berlin and 9 in Mumbai. And that really helped them figure out where should we put these hub cities. And then they reimagined their recruiting efforts in order to recruit tech talent in those hubs and overall increase the effectiveness of those teams. So then for our final pathway, motivating the transformation. So this one also has a number of key levers. This is about, leaders really role modeling the behaviors, but importantly, also creating safe spaces for employees to adapt. And so naturally that leads to, more of the need to experiment. And we know that experimentation will result sometimes in success and sometimes in failure. And so as part of that, we really wanted to understand, what are organizations' orientations when it comes to experimentation and failure. And what we saw is, there are some interesting regional differences, and there are certainly companies, particularly in the US and Europe, that are still struggling in these dimensions. So on the left-hand side, what you see is orientation toward experimentation. And in the US and Europe, more of those companies kind of adopted their plan and stuck to it, not making many changes or experimenting along the way. It's quite a different dynamic in China where, the vast majority of those companies really encouraged experimentation. And as we reflected on those results, I think it's a commentary on the pace of change in China and needing to, very rapidly keep up. And the cost of trying new things is relatively low. And so from that standpoint, there's, a real kind of orientation to pilots, initiatives, seeing what works and adapting accordingly. On the other side of the slide is tolerance of failure. And here you can see that more than half of companies are either, actively discouraging or at least not fully supporting the notion of failure through their ways of working. And, so of course, it's human nature not to want to fail, but at the same time, we think that, if companies aren't failing, it may mean that they're not pushing hard enough in terms of trying new things or really expanding their boundaries. And so from that perspective, we think that the only true failure is the failure not to learn. So it's important to, reflect on both successes and lessons learned, capture those to be shared with other teams, and put a clear plan in place in terms of what do we need to change moving forward in order to get on the track that we need. And so in our interviews, we definitely wanted to dig into how have companies been able to sort of change the orientation around failure. And we heard a few different approaches that we wanted to share with you. So the first one comes from a leader at United Airlines who talked about, expanding the notion of safety, which is so critical to, how they operate as a business, and expanding it to include this idea of psychological safety. And this is really important for cultures, whether it's airlines or healthcare, where making mistakes, can be catastrophic. But it's important to understand, like, what are, the accidents, incidents, near misses that may be happening in those cultures, and creating a truly safe, no blame culture in which employees are free to speak up about those and know that those will be treated as a learning opportunity. And so psychological safety and trust is even more critical, especially in certain industries. Nationwide Building Society, which is a British financial services organization, so they took a really structured approach to experimentation. And it started in behavioral science, and they created a program around it called Test, Learn, Adapt. And what this looked like was, across their top 200 and ultimately even their top 1,000 leaders, they created a number of different teams who were tasked with really kind of looking at what are some of the key barriers in the organization and coming up with, ideas and ways to experiment in terms of how to improve those. And so, for instance, one of the teams actually focused on like, how can we, equip different teams to experiment? And what they worked on was something called a team talk, which would equip teams not only with the tools in terms of executing experiments, but what's kind of the right conversation to get to the insights needed to figure out where this team is best equipped to focus. And so there were a series of questions that ultimately figured out, as a team, what are our strengths, where should we focus? And with that, they scaled the approach to 40 teams. And so there were 20 teams as a control and 20 teams as a test. And when they got the results back, and they were very positive, but there was one unexpected success around the psychological well-being of these teams, which had really improved. And so I think that points to, the power of experimentation to help teams work more effectively together and create greater impact. That's very motivating. And then the final example we wanted to share is around the idea of champions networks. So we spoke to a leader at Dawn Foods, which is a US-based bakery ingredient manufacturer. And similarly, they had a group of about 200 leaders that were being asked to work in ways that were very different related to their digital transformation. And we're trying to figure out how to kind of move them from what their old habits were. So they identified a set of 30 or so leaders and called them their digital launch champions. And the idea was that this would be, a program where they would, these digital launch champions would get early access to information, be able to provide input. But on the flip side, they were truly going to be held accountable for, driving change and holding themselves, their peers, and their managers accountable for doing the same thing. They also shared a fun anecdote, which I think speaks to the power of symbols in culture. So after they did the initial meeting for the Digital Launch Champions program, all of the participants, in terms of the change champions, received like a huge gold costume chain necklace, and it said, "The future is ours." So a little bit tongue-in-cheek, if you were to see it, but I think the idea is that this serves as a very visible reminder, both to the champion and to those around them, that they are part of this community and have a real responsibility to the transformation. So just to summarize before we move into Q&A, so we spent a lot of time today talking about the 4 different pathways and focusing on one of those at any given time. But it's still very important to remember that in the end, there's no silver bullet. There's no one pathway that's going to get you to the impact of the transformation that you're seeking. And so it's really about integrating all elements of the human-centered transformation model: DNA, body, mind, and soul. Or said differently, all organizations at some point during their transformation will need to move through all 4 pathways. However, as the second point, we really do believe that focus is a way to yield progress. And by focusing on a targeted set of change levers at any given time, the ones that your organization really needs most to break through your key barriers, that's going to yield greater impact than if you were to do partial efforts across the full set of levers. And then the final point, so we didn't talk about this in the lead up to this slide, but we wanted to capture it here because we think it's really important. So we added a chapter this year around what are the most important leadership characteristics of transformation. And there was one characteristic that stood out as among the most important in all 4 of the geographies that we had in our study. And that characteristic was inviting many different voices to contribute and be heard, which was something that definitely resonated powerfully with us. At Profit, one of our core values is many voices, one team. And what that's always meant to us is, the power of diverse perspectives and inclusivity to truly get to, more effective teams and better results. And I think that notion has never been more important than it is now. So I'd really encourage you to spend time with the leadership chapter in the report and be on the lookout. We are planning to do a webinar later this year focused specifically on the idea of leadership and these important characteristics, because we truly believe that leadership is absolutely fundamental to the success of transformation. So one last chance to submit questions. What don't you know that you want to know? And then with our remaining 13 minutes, we will get into some of the Q&A, and Tony's going to MC that for us.
First up in the Q&A, while people are thinking about other questions, and I'll ask Helen to take this one on, is from Sandra Pickering, which is, what is the role of storytelling in creating a sustaining change?
Sorry, just unmute myself. So if people have engaged with our 2019 research, and it was on an earlier slide, that rapidly sharing lessons learned and the power of storytelling definitely came through as an accelerator, culture lever that accelerates in transformation last year. We had, when we were doing the work on the leadership traits this year, we actually saw quite an interesting kind of contrast though, where we found that really what, when we asked about that under the context of kind of what people wanted to see, believe the leadership impact was, this was down the list. And I think our view is that, of course, it's really important, and this is not a new thing, that storytelling and the authenticity of how people are experiencing transformation is really important inside an organization. However, I think stories fall flat if there's not a foundation of trust in the road ahead. And I think given the timing of this research, I think the search and the need for how leaders were managing and continue to manage through uncertainty and give clarity on the direction of travel and how an organization is going to respond to both transformation and some of the immediate issues that the last few months are creating for organizations. If that clarity isn't there, storytelling doesn't make up for that. So part of the mix, important, but not a silver bullet in its own right.
Thank you. Next up, and I think I would suggest that maybe Christine go first on this one, and then maybe Helen and Amanda want to pick it up. From the 4 enablers, which is the most common and most difficult to surpass?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by surpass, but
I think he probably means overcome.
Overcome. Okay. Well, I think, some of what we've seen is the barrier around legacy systems feels to people like the biggest lift, because they have to, get into all sorts of equipment and technical and relearning, retooling, big investments. So that one, it's always felt a little bit more fraught with hurdles. I think the one around people is probably the most fungible in a sense, if I could use that word, because people are willing to learn. They can be trained. You can have conversations with them. You can meet with them. You can share. They have shared values with you and shared goals. So there's that aspect of being able to align with them. You can't talk to the technology. You have to sort of build it, buy it, build it, and train on it. Whereas the people will show up day one, and most of them will start to work with you.
I can add 2 perspectives there. So, you know, what actually led us to want to explore this idea of pathways, or how are companies focusing on a set of a few levers, is that when we first looked at, you know, again, that set of 11 levers and gauged the progress that companies were making against them, one thing we saw was that there wasn't necessarily a clear pattern in terms of, you know, one part of the model where companies were struggling more than others. And so from that perspective, and even, you know, borne out in the conversations that we've had, I think it's tough to say that there's one that, you know, is really kind of most commonly the most difficult. That being said, I think the one that, if you didn't address it, would impede the progress of all the others would be defining the transformation. That's the only, within the pathways, that's the only one that has an aspect of sequence to it, in that we would say you need to start first with defining the transformation, and actually, you know, really think intentionally about the different levers that are part of it. So setting a powerful, actionable ambition and tying that into the clear change strategy that I discussed, and also clarifying leadership. Because without that, the efforts that would happen in any of the other three pathways would fall, you know, hollow or on deaf ears if they're not clearly tied back to, you know, the change that the organization is looking to drive.
And I think it's fair to say, Amanda, isn't it, that, you know, you've got a recent client experience where you've been looking at their change muscle, and this is not a new problem for them, but the findings took us very firmly back to that as a fairly foundational focus that they were struggling to display.
And Helen, while you're up front and center, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to answer this one. Have you found that leaders are open to recognizing and accepting that their perspective is not necessarily accurate? Or do you find that ego gets in the way of candor and considered debate on culture?
Yes, I have seen that. But I don't know that it's, in some ways, I don't know that it's always ego, or whether it's more about the way still leadership kind of groups are set up and incentivized, to be frank with you, because I think organizations are still fraught by silos getting in the way of collaboration, innovation, and transformation. And this very morning, we were having a discussion about an organization we've done 3 years work with, where there is such a limited appetite to move, if you want, to what now needs to be done within that organization, because of a sort of a leadership team caught somewhat in a sort of trap of ambivalence and fear. So I don't know that it's ego. I think it is unfortunately kind of the structures that sort of solidify leadership teams. I do think you know, that the kind of need, as Amanda talked to, in that that first and control tower pathway, to get to a place where there is a shared and interdependent vision is really critical. It's when the KPIs and all the incentives are designed to drive much more of that interdependency and collaboration, that I see organizational teams starting to make, leadership teams starting to make the breakthrough that is needed. I don't know, Tony, if you want to add to that.
No, given the limited time, I want to make sure that we hit some of the other topics. Okay. There's one question here, which is, what would a transformation management office look like, and what kind of roles are in the TMO? We've actually done a lot of work in setting up transformation management offices. It comes hand in hand with sustaining transformation. And generally speaking, they have 6 core functions. So the first is setting vision and strategy for the transformation. So they become the owners of that once it's been established, ideally by the C-suite. The second is portfolio management and governance. So maintaining the roadmap of all the different work streams that need to happen over the course of several years to drive the transformation. The third that a lot of TMOs leave out is execution support. So being able to consult to projects and work streams and help them figure out how to solve problems in a proactive way. The fourth is value realization and reporting. So keeping the KPI tree or value driver matrix and making sure that the analytics are being produced against that so people can understand progress against their goals. Change management communications, which may already live somewhere else in the enterprise and then needs to second resources to the TMO, or for some reason may be lacking and needs to be stood up explicitly within the TMO. Most enterprises have some component of that. And the last part is transformation capabilities and culture. So when going back to the original point about building a change readiness, often TMOs take on a component of establishing what are new behaviors and ways of working, and then helping to instill those in the culture as the transformation moves forward. So those are some of the standard things. If you'd like to talk more about that, we'd be happy to chat about that directly. There's a question here about, do you find that clients expect this process to be, quote, digital fast, or are they ready to invest the time it needs? I'll take the first pass at that, and then I'll ask the others if they'd like to respond to it. I think everybody starts out by saying we want it to be digitally fast. And then when we start working in Agile, because we run all of our transformations in Agile, generally in Scrum, and they see the pace at which we're gonna move, we often get, please slow down. So you have to try to find the ability of the organization to absorb and to focus, to find sort of the Goldilocks level of that, and then push as fast as you can go. If you let your foot up off the gas, if you will, then you start to signal to the organization that change isn't something that's this transformation isn't being taken seriously. So there's a level of creating, I would say, just the right amount of anxiety, and also demonstrating to people that they can be in what Csikszentmihalyi would call flow while working against the transformation, that you can take them right up against the limits of their capabilities and make it engaging and fun and a transformative experience for themselves professionally as well as for the firm. That would be my take. Christine or Amanda, I see you wanted to say something.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Christine.
All right, Amanda, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think in my experience, many clients recognize that this level of transformation, will be a multi-year journey. But I think it's really important when you are, building and designing the roadmap to design into it early on, what are some quick wins, potentially some softballs to really get the momentum going, drive buy-in and gain belief among those who maybe haven't been fully aligned against that journey. And, as part of doing that, one of the key levers that we talked about is recognizing progress, not just outcomes. And so it becomes a really critical point to, celebrate that progress that's being made as an overall accelerator to the transformation.
I realize, yeah, did you want to add?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay. I realize we are right up at the end of the time that we had prepared for, and people have started to drop off. So thank you so much for your time and your attention and your questions. We will endeavor to answer anyone's directly that we weren't able to answer here in the webinar. If you would like to reach out to us, we would love to hear from you. If for some reason you've not yet read the report, in the chat, Nicola has just put the download link. And we thank you all so much for your time, your attention, your questions. It's been a pleasure being with you today. And with that, we'll wish you a lovely rest of the day wherever you are.